They're constantly fiddling with the placement of the controls. All right. And all right. Very good. Okay, let's get into. All right, there we go. So I think we can see things in Warminster. Can you guys see our screen remotely? Yes, we are. Yep. All right, very good. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, here live in Warminster and online. And you can just see me waving here because I'm a little bit off camera. But I'm Eleanor Rangers. I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We are a nonprofit dedicated to preserving Cold War history in the greater Southeastern Pennsylvania area. We primarily started out in collecting oral histories, but kind of have extended our reach into additional historical preservation with the Naval Air Development Center and the Old Johnsville Centrifuge here in Warminster. So if you're ever planning a visit, definitely let us know. We'd love to meet you here to give you a tour. We are in the process of actually planning some activities associated with the upcoming, what is it, the semi-cinquennial, the 250th anniversary of America. And every state, of course, has their own initiatives as well. We are a nonprofit affiliate for the PA 250 group, and not quite ready for prime time yet, but I've got something up my sleeve that has to do with aerospace heritage. So stay tuned for more information soon about what we're planning for next year. Whoops, there we go. All right. So actually, I can actually change my screen this time and say that this is an actual lecture tonight live rather than just a webinar. So I was kind of happy I could switch that out. And I would like to thank the folks here at the Fuge for allowing us the generous use of this space in their audiovisual, and Jim Crivero for helping to set everything up for the live stream here. And our event this evening is in the studio. And this was actually named, in case you were wondering, this actually houses a working state-of-the-art recording studio that actually has recorded Grammy Award-winning music. And actually, Jim Crivero oversees that studio. So I'm thankful that he's around to be able to help set up the audiovisual here. Restrooms, if you need them during the event, are actually around the corner from the wall here, and there's a ladies and men's room basically behind that wall. And I know maybe some of you may have stopped by downstairs before the event, but there is an actual brew pub downstairs, and definitely would encourage you, if not this evening, but some other time, to come check out their brews and their food. They actually do a very nice job downstairs, so I definitely recommend them. And believe it or not, there is also a spa downstairs as well. And I understand they're putting in a salt cave, so that may be something to keep in mind if you have any interest. I also do want to mention, as a nonprofit organization, we certainly do greatly appreciate any donations that folks may choose to make to our organization. No donation is too small. Everything is directly rolled into our historical preservation efforts. So I do want to assure you of that. I also want to give you a little preview. Speaking of what donations go towards, so I've actually commissioned a local artist who was involved in aviation for many years, just retired locally. But I actually have commissioned him to produce several images of aircraft that were tested or were part of programs here at the Naval Air Development Center when it was operating. And we're going to create a coloring book that we'll be able to basically sell, and the proceeds of that would go into our organization. We do have a separate coloring book that we developed last year for for our space race event last July. And actually, Gary Campbell, who is the artist, developed those images as well. So if you ever have any interest in that, in purchasing those, let me know. But I wanted to give you a little preview of the rough sketches for the new aviation-oriented coloring book that Gary's in the process of putting together. And you can see the front end of a P-3 Orion in the upper left and an S-3A, another ASW platform there in the lower right. So just another preview of stuff we have going on. We also maintain a YouTube channel under the name of our organization, so definitely check there periodically for updated content. We do, as we're recording this evening, these programs are generally uploaded to that site as well if you wanted to, do any on-demand viewing or if you missed the program and wanted to make sure you caught that. So just wanted to mention that in passing. We also maintain a Facebook page. If any of you are on that social media platform, I do try to keep that updated with our program announcements and sometimes other related Cold War or space race related news articles, photos, and so forth that I may run across in social media. And this is a listing of our 2025 lectures and webinars. Here we are in April, of course, and we'll be introducing Lou in a moment. But actually next month, we have Jim Sobek online virtually, but he will be here in Warminster to give a talk about the terminal guidance system on the Tomahawk cruise missile, which I'm very excited to learn more about. And then we have, a number of other, some repeat speakers as well. David Stumpf, who's kind of our resident missile expert, will be back to give another talk. Stephen Walker, who's spoken for us several times. He's actually based in the UK. He'll be back this year to talk about Germain Titov, actually from an early Russian cosmonaut. Then, you can see everything else that's coming towards the end of the year, concluding in December with actually a former NADC employee, Art Orbach, who is going to be talking about sonobuoys. So I'm excited because I've been chasing Art for several years. So about doing a sonobuoy talk. So I'm happy he was willing to give that talk. Here's a preview for Jim's talk coming up next month. We are also going to be attempting our live streaming as well for Jim's talk. So please hope you can make it here if you are local. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker this evening, Lou McIntyre. His background, as I've found online, he says that his background is unusual. He's an engineer who can actually write. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy with a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering and received a master's in the same field from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. He spent his Navy career flying various aircraft. Was involved with the TACAMO program, which we're going to learn more about tonight, and retired in 1990. And then he began a second career as a civilian contractor for the Navy, retiring from that second career in 2020 to pursue writing full time. He has a passion for history and loves historical fiction that brings the past to life, putting the reader in a time machine back to a time like our own, but also very different. He's a member of the Historical Writers of America, the Maryland Writers Association, and is vice president of the Charles County chapter of the Maryland Writers Association. He's also a member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, the IEEE, and the American Association of Physics Teachers. So without further ado, we are going to adjust our microphone and get Lou up here to talk TACAMO. Oh, I also, as we're adjusting the mic, I do want to just show you an image here of not only, whoops, hold on, not only Lou's books, but also his wife, who has joined us this evening, who is also an author herself. And unfortunately, for those of you who are local, the local folks here can actually purchase books that we have here available. Although if anyone online is interested in purchasing books, please reach out to me. I'm sure we can make some sort of arrangement with that. But I think all of these are available on Amazon. Is that correct?
They're all available on Amazon, and also you can order a signed copy through my website.
Okay. All right. So let us know if any of you online have that interest. All right. I think since you have your notes, we don't need to do presenter mode. Is that
No.
correct? Okay. All right. So
I don't, it's gonna be more trouble than it's worth.
gotcha. Okay. All right. So we're going to do that and okay. And then I'm going to get out of your way. And yep. And if you can speak as much as possible into the microphone, just so our folks online can hear. All right. Thank you.
Good evening. And thank you for inviting me. I am honored to be here. And I want to thank Eleanor for setting all of this up, and Jim. I want to thank my wife, without whom none of this would have been possible, my academy classmate and company mate, John Eckert, and my first boss, Jim Jabinski. And I also want to thank Dan, N1DH, who just checked in, one of my friends from the Brothers Net, for which we do a 40-meter trivia quiz on Monday nights. Thank you all, and let's get into it. If anybody had told me in 1972, when I first checked into my Squadron VQ4, that I would spend the next half century in strategic communication and then write a book about it, I'd have said, you have rocks in your head. Nobody can have a career in TACAMO. It's not possible. But we did. Now, by way of background, I got my wings in 1972, and I was in the A6 intruder pipeline, and I was supposed to spend the next 3 years or the closing days of the Vietnam War flying low-level attack missions there. But as it was, I wound up being assigned to a C-130 squadron, and oh yes, the first thing I had to learn was navigation using Celestial and Loran to find my way across the Atlantic. Oh, by the way, none of that was covered in the intruder pipeline. They didn't carry Celestial. So it was a challenging thing. So this is going to be the story about TACAMO. And most importantly, it's a story about a few people. It's common knowledge that a few people can't change very much, if at all. But this is the story of how just 12 people brought this community into being when it was a career-killing backwater, and how we made it into the respected organization that it is today. Turn it on.
Do you need to advance the slide?
Yes, please. I don't know why that's suddenly not working. Okay, first off, what is TACAMO? For those of you who don't know, I know the VQ4 guy does, but it is an airborne relay program to transmit critical messages from the national command authorities to the nuclear missile submarines. And that mission has been extended in the last 30 years to include all nuclear forces. And it's a very important mission. It began in 1962, kind of in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we have always used very low frequency to communicate with submerged submarines. For those of you who don't know, very low frequency is just above the audio band, 17 to 30 kilohertz. and the use of VLF, the knowledge that VLF would penetrate water goes back to the very beginning of radio in the early 1900s, the days of spark gap transmitters and Branly coherers. And they found that their receivers worked better if the wire antenna was submerged. And the reason for this was because the main interference on VLF was from lightning, and lightning is horizontally polarized. And the VLF transmitters, as best they could, because of the wavelength, were transmitting vertically polarized signals. And so more signal got to the wire when it was submerged than it did from the lightning. And in 1920, a submarine copied a German VLF broadcast station off the coast of New Jersey, 100 feet down, 3,000 miles away. Okay, CNO project number 1 was what kicked it all off. CNO project number 1 kicked it all off. And this consisted of a typed up tasking memo, as everything was those days, from the head of naval communication to then Lieutenant Jerry O. Tuttle, tasking him to find a way to transmit VLF from an aircraft to submerged submarines. And on that tasking memo, he scrawled, "Take charge and move out." Admirals did that sort of thing when they handed tasking memos to junior officers. So he had to deploy a 5-mile long antenna from an aircraft. And because it had to be vertical, the aircraft had to be in an orbit with the drogue descending down around the cone to about 1,500 feet above sea level. Walt Reese, Lieutenant Commander Walt Reese, is his son here tonight? Hello. Your father flew some of the very first test flights in Willie Victor 121s using a 5-mile long target towing wire as a surrogate antenna. I believe he did not have a transmitter on there. I've never been able to verify that, but he made all sorts of flights to determine the issues of deploying and then orbiting with a trailing wire antenna. And that was done here out of Johnsville, Pennsylvania Naval Air Station. Jerry Tuttle put together some vans with HF radios for receiving the uplink messages, and a Collins radio provided 20 kilowatt VLF transmitter and reel to transmit those messages to the submarines by manual Morse and teletype. He got his proof of concept going in just 1 year. And when Collins Radio asked him what to put on the vans, he looked at his tasking memo and he said, TACAMO. And they said, "What's that stand for?" And he said, "Take charge and move out." And the name is stuck. Yeah, again. In 1964, just 2 years later, the Navy deployed 4 roll-on, roll-off vans in C-130s with HF uplink, VLF downlink, and they assigned 2 of the vans to Guam to be flown by Hercs with the Weather Squadron number 1, and 2 to Patuxent River to be flown by Transport Squadron 1. It's amazing how fast you can get things done when you don't have computers to generate tons of shelfware that is read once, if at all, but is necessary to be checked off in the box to show that you did it. Next. Okay, in 1968, the Navy reached full operational capability. They stood up 2 squadrons, VQ-3 at Guam with 600 officers and men, and VQ-4 at Patuxent River with 1,000. They procured 8 new aircraft, numbers 170 through 177, with built-in comm suites, no more vans, and these were designated as EC-130Qs. They had VLF, HF, and UHF uplinks, and the first generation tactical satellite communication system. They had 20 kilowatts of VLF downlink, the same as the vans, and they assigned 4 of those aircraft to each squadron. The C-130Es that had been carrying the vans were stripped out, the same comm suite built into them, and these were designated as EC-130Gs, 888 through 891. And these were assigned to VQ-4, giving them a total of 8 aircraft. Atlantic had the priority because of the way the submarines were deployed, and by 1970, they were flying 100% airborne coverage. What that means is that 24/7, there was a TACAMO aircraft in the air ready to relay a message to the missile subs if needed. Fortunately, in all of that ensuing 55 years, we've never had to send anything but exercise messages. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation. VQ-3, with 4 aircraft and a lower priority, was flying 50% coverage. Next. They had their first accident in 1972, about a couple of months before I checked in, by the way. And number 890 had an outboard fuel quantity indicator problem, and the flight engineer had pulled the circuit breaker. He went in, he wrote up the maintenance discrepancy, and the next flight engineer missed that when he read on them. And when the fuel quantity indicator was not working, he plugged the circuit breaker back in, and he got fuel quantity indications. He also put 115 volts AC into the outboard wing tank, which promptly caught on fire, burned off most of the aileron and part of the port wing, and the aircraft ditched in a cornfield on the eastern shore with both pilots on the yoke and rudder to keep the airplane straight. It's quite a surprise to the cows on the farm and also to Bessie Smith, who owned the cornfield. There were no casualties. Everybody walked away, no injuries, but the aircraft was strike damaged and it was scrapped. The comm suite was salvaged, but having been in a strike accident, was no longer flyable. So what do you do with a comm suite that you can't fly? Well, VQ-4 took it and reused it as their first full fidelity trainer. something we would not have been able to have funded any other way. But having got one, we've kept something like that going for the next 55 years. And I used to work at the sill in Pax River, which I used to call the E6 without wings. This accident affected aircraft availability and was going to have some impact downstream. Next. The first major upgrade came in 1973. This added a 200 kilowatt power amplifier, more than 10 times the power. It added a dual trailing wire antenna for better efficiency. The long wire emerged from the base of the ramp door, which doesn't open on that bird, while the short wire extended from the tail. And in the orbit, the short wire, which is about a mile long, trails behind while the long wire descends below and forms an off-center fed J, which gives us better efficiency and a lower angle, better for penetrating the water. The new reels would extend the wire at 6,000 feet per minute, which let you reach operational length in under 5 minutes, depending on frequency. Had lighter, stronger wires, which caused us some problems with yo-yo, which we learned to deal with. And it had a digital signal processing for the downlink with a computer that still used ferrite memory cores. If those of you who have a history of computer, that's a little ferrite ring with some wire wrapped around it, and you can set it to be a 1 or a 0, 1 bit. But it worked. This was a long mod program, taking several months to change out the airplane. And this forced a VQ4 stand down from 100%, partly due to the loss of 890, even though they were borrowing aircraft from VQ3. And in the midst of that stand down came the Arab-Israeli War of 73. And because the Soviets were threatening to intervene, strategic forces went on DEFCON 3, and TACAMO came up with the War Watch. And what they did with the War Watch is that half the crew stood ground alert on the aircraft with all circuits active and monitored for 6 hours. Then the whole crew came on board and they flew a 12-hour mission, and then the other half of the crew took over and stood another 6 hours. With that, they were able to fly, they were able to achieve 100% circuit coverage with just 50% airborne. Next. And VQ3 had the first fatal accident. I was leaving Monterey the day after graduation, and I heard on the car radio that the Navy had lost a C-130 in the Pacific. And I thought, gee, I hope that's not one of mine. And it was. 177 had flown out of Hawaii, flown a transmit event, which involved orbiting and being on station for a few hours, and then landed at Wake Island to refuel, and then took off shortly after midnight to go back to Guam. The aircraft flew into the ocean shortly after takeoff, no radio calls, no fire, no sign of any distress, and all 16 people were killed. I was supposed to be relieving the aircraft commander, Lieutenant Jack Strunk. This further exacerbated aircraft availability and drove VQ-3 for a time into single airplane operations with disastrous effects on crew morale. And VQ-3 still shows Crew 4 forever deployed on their op status board. Next slide. TACAMO began its life as an interim solution. We were a very expensive and complicated solution to a problem that was ultimately going to be solved by space-based blue-green lasers and land-based extremely low frequency transmitting actually below the audio frequencies, neither one of which ever came to fruition. ELF tried, but it didn't work out well. The enlisted people had Navy enlisted classification codes that identified them as TACAMO specialists, and they were closed-loop details, so their skills stayed in the community. But there was no such tag for officers, such a thing as a warfare specialty. The only people that appreciated TACAMO was the submarine community, but they did not sit on TACAMO selection boards. So as a result, from the time the two squadrons were established until 1974, not a single lieutenant was promoted to lieutenant commander from the community. This is a very important promotion for naval officers. This is equivalent to getting your tenure at a university, because if you make lieutenant commander, you can complete a Navy career, compete for commander and command, and go on from there to the rest of your career as high as you can go. If you don't select for lieutenant commander, you have to get out of the Navy at the end of your tour or when your obligated service is up. So this was becoming a one and done tour for junior officers. They either went immediately to patrol aviation to get their warfare specialty and stay in that community for the rest of their life, or they got out of the Navy. The COs came from the VP community, patrol aviation, ASW, and the mid-level department heads were passed over lieutenant commanders from patrol, transport, and weather squadrons. There was no corporate knowledge building up with that kind of structure. In 1974, a very significant individual, Bill Coyne, came to the community from VP, as they all were, and he had in mind to take VQ4 and switch it from a McHale's Navy outfit to a team of real professionals. And as you can imagine, that didn't go over very well. He was not a popular CO. But he's still active in the community to this day, and I just talked to him a few days ago. He and his predecessor had laid the groundwork for this to become a warfare specialty, working with the Bureau of Personnel. But Bureau Personnel said, we can't make this a warfare specialty. Nobody comes back to the community. Of course not. Nobody comes back to the community. It's not a warfare specialty. So But he laid the groundwork. All they needed were retreads. And in the late 70s, a dozen of us, just a dozen, made the leap of faith to bet our careers on a community that didn't yet exist, that we could make this happen. All we had was a faith in our abilities and also a belief in the TACAMO mission. Next slide. In 1979, we were rewarded when we became that warfare specialty. And the dam broke. By the 1980s, the department heads were all TACAMO lieutenant commanders. The first TACAMO commanders had screened for command. That's Bob Downey and Phil Baca. And a little interesting aside, if you go out to Tinker Air Force Base, where VQ3 and 4 are today, they have the board of photographs of all of their commanding officers going back to the beginning. By careful coordination, okay, in 1982, the Navy allowed those pictures to be made in color because prior to that, they were all black and white. And by careful coordination, since Bob Downey was skipper before, or I'm sorry, Phil Baca was skipper before Bob Downey, they held off on VQ4, and Phil Baca and Bob Downey, the first TACAMO COs, are also the first COs in color. The TACAMO types also held down important positions afloat and ashore. Carrier communications officers was a very popular tour because our hands-on experience with communications allowed us to make major contributions in that area. We held down major points in the TACAMO program office, in NAVAIR, and also at the Chief of Naval Operations and the operational and administrative commanders, SINCLANT, SINCPAC, AIRLANT, and AIRPAC. Next slide. 1980s brought major new TACAMO programs. These were electromagnetic pulse hardening, the TACAMO Improvement Program, and the ECX replacement. Next. Electromagnetic pulse is generated by a high-altitude nuclear burst outside the atmosphere that generates a transient pulse of very short duration and high magnitude. And this is capable of damaging, degrading, or upsetting electronic circuits over a 500-mile radius. And this is critical to TACAMO because if you were able to disable TACAMO with an EMP burst without knowing exactly where TACAMO is, then you have just cut the link to the missile subs. So a very important thing. The approach used on this was called hull hardening. They didn't harden the equipment. They hardened the hull that it was contained in because the hull is a Faraday shield. And if the Faraday shield is perfect, then EMP can't get in. And so it was a process of shielding, filtering, and limiting. For example, the windscreens have a fine wire mesh embedded inside them, bonded to the fuselage. The doors to the fuselage and the doors to the electronics bays inside the aircraft have copper bonding to ensure that they have close connectivity to the fuselage. Antennas, which by definition have to penetrate the fuselage are filtered and limited to mitigate pulse effects on the equipment downstream. I was at the Operational Test and Evaluation Force, and I was tasked with doing this op eval. And my previous predecessor, yeah, that's redundant, my previous predecessor had written up a humorous comment in the test and evaluation master plan, which had a very important section called limitation to scope. And in that, he said the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty prohibits the use of nuclear weapons to generate EMP for this test. Yep, sounds about right. But, in fact, there were facilities available for testing, and they were at the Air Force Weapons Lab in Albuquerque. And here you see the trestle, which is an all-wood platform, with a TACAMO C-130 891 sitting on it. I didn't use the trestle because for technical issues, this never really quite got up to threat level for pulsing. I used something called the vertical dipole, which did. And we took 891 down there, and with all circuits operating, the aircraft fully manned, we did everything except transmit VLF, which you can't do on the ground very well. And we pulsed the aircraft several times an hour for a week with no effects other than that when you were hitting the pulse, you could see WWV on the oscilloscope fade out and then come back as the AGC clamped it down. Except for the last day. There was a right way and a wrong way. There was a right way to dress out the power cable on there. It was supposed to be coiled and at right angles to the field. And the last day, somebody didn't do that. And the first shot of the day, the aircraft went dark. And I said, aha, I got a failure. And all it had done was trip the overvoltage sensor on the power cart and caused it to shut down. We restarted the power cart, brought the aircraft back up, and everything worked for the rest of the day. Part of this testing was something called the Hardness Assurance Maintenance Surveillance. And that was a program to ensure that once the aircraft was hard, that it would stay hard. And it was a set of periodic repulsing of the aircraft after major maintenance or major mod. And the vertically polarized dipole that I used for my testing is now at Pax River and used as part of that program. And today, TACAMO is considered the gold standard for aircraft hardening. Next. The TACAMO Improvement Program, or TIP, was a major improvement to aircraft uplinks and message processing. It added state-of-the-art satellite communication, connectivity to the Fleet and Air Force satellite systems, Fleet SATCOM and AFSATCOM, and it added computerized message processing for reception, storage, editing, and forwarding of text messages. Next. And finally, there was the ECX program. The C-130s had been ridden hard and put away wet for 20 years. Among other things, when they landed on a deployment, they were immediately refueled for a full mission and sat on the ramp for a day or more with the wings bending the wrong way. This caused cracks in the wing center box, which was another major maintenance demand on airframes in the 70s and early 80s. Boeing proposed the ECX in 1979. This was a Boeing 707 with CFM56 fan jet engines and wings tailored to perform the TACAMO orbit. This was funded in 1982 with leftover strategic funds from the Trident missile program, as a couple of submarines had been canceled as part of the SALT limitation talks. And this money could only be spent on strategic systems. Put away, that's a horse expression. That's a horsey. In other words, if you ride your horse hard and you put him away wet, he's going to be sweaty and he's going to get sick. And that's what happened to the hurt. Okay? And the first article was delivered in 1986. Again, this is another rapid TACAMO acquisition, going from a proposal in 79 to a first article ready for testing in 86. Next. VQ3 had some big challenges at this time. This is the time from 1980 to 1983. 3 years, count them, 3. And they were supposed to relocate to Barbers Point, Hawaii, which is a big deal in itself. They were going to expand from 600 to 1,000 people. Their fleet was going to grow from 3 to 8 aircraft, 130s, and they were supposed to stand up to 100% airborne coverage. And do all this while transitioning into that new Tip 2 comm suite. My last job in VQ3 was to plan this transition. I went to the exchange and I bought every pack of large graph paper that I could get my hands on, and every colored pencil they had. I had taken a course in program evaluation and review technique while I was in the squadron from the IEEE, and so I knew how to do this, and this was in the days before Microsoft Project. And so I and my warrant officer laid out every identifiable item that had to be done to make this transition, and you have no idea how many details there are in that. And when they had to be done, what they depended on being done before you could do them, and what had to be done after them and depended on them being finished before you could start the next. And I laid out, I think, 3 or 4 sheets of these big pieces of graph paper, scotch taped them together, and brought them in to the department head meeting to brief the skipper. And they became known as the Navajo Indian blanket. And that term is still used today in VQ3 to describe any complicated problem. My legacy. So this took place under the leadership of Phil Baca, who was our first homegrown CO and my mentor on my first tour in VQ4. And he flew his first 100% coverage mission 3 months ahead of schedule. Quite an accomplishment. Next. Can't talk about this without talking about women in TACAMO. Women began flying in the Navy in the 70s, but and the number of women coming into aviation increased in the 80s as the ROTC and Academy graduates came online. Problem: laws at the time prevented them from serving in combat, which meant they were excluded from most Navy squadrons. Now, go figure, TACAMO is the pointy end of the nuclear spear, but it was considered non-combat. And it had a warfare specialty that gave them a path to command and beyond. And we had an initial cadre of 16 women in both squadrons, and many of these went on to TACAMO command or to command other squadrons. One took command of the TACAMO wing that was still 10 years in the future, and 4 became admirals. And our most senior alumna is Vice Admiral Nora Wingate Tyson. And I just went to her Lifetime Achievement Award in Tucson, Arizona. She started 10 years behind me in VQ4, but found a totally different squadron. A very professional squadron. And she rose to command VQ4, and then she went on to command the USS Baton, a heavy amphibious ship. She made flag rank and took command of Carrier Strike Group 2, the first woman to ever do that. And she ultimately made Vice Admiral and took command of the 3rd Fleet, from which she retired in 2017. And she most graciously wrote the foreword to my book back there. Next slide. Okay. The transition from Herc to Merc was going to be difficult. There were no large multi-engine jet aircraft in the inventory in the Navy. So VQ3 assigned future pilots to the U.S. Air Force to fly EC-135s. And the E6 was about twice as heavy as the Herc, and this required extensive runway and hangar modification and taxiway mods. Anyway, they had a plan. Everything was going well. The Herc pilots all had their orders to their next duty station. The Merc pilots were coming in just ahead of the Merc. All that was left was a few more flight tests. And the tail broke up while doing a high-speed rudder reversal. Well, they did it again just to see if that was a fluke, and it was not. And this put a 1-year delay in there. All of those outgoing Herc pilots suddenly got an order mod, keeping them on until, and the Merc pilots tried to wear their flight suits as often as possible to remind themselves that they were still pilots, even though there was nothing in the squadron for them to fly yet. And so this threw chaos into an orderly transition plan. But they pulled it off a year late under my first navigator student, Vern Lockhausen, and they made the transition to the Merc. Next slide. The expensive mods needed to naval air stations to support the E6 added impetus to a growing desire to relocate strategic assets such as TACAMO to Mid-Conus for survivability. And a number of congressmen from a number of different states all competed to keep or to get TACAMO into their home districts. Oklahoma won out, and Tinker Air Force Base was selected as the new home port for a couple of reasons. One is the E-6A was a common airframe to the E-3 that was based there. The Air Force facilities could handle the larger, heavier aircraft because they had plenty of large, heavy aircraft. And Tinker also had the heavy maintenance facility for E-3 maintenance that could be used on the E-6. And based on a diagram drawn on a napkin, literally, by Barry Coyle in the late 80s, Strategic Communications Wing 1 was commissioned in 1992. Prior to this time, TACAMO had been under the command of Fleet Tactical Support Wing 1, which handled primarily transport aircrafts, and Patrol Wing 1 in the Pacific, which handled anti-submarine aircraft, neither one of which had any particular background in the TACAMO mission. Wing 1 was to be staffed by TACAMO professionals and commanded by a Navy captain who was a past TACAMO CO, and it was commissioned in 1992. Jerry O. Tuttle, then a lieutenant, now a vice admiral, who had given us our name 30 years before, spoke at the commissioning with Vice President Dan Quayle. And true believer Andy Riddle was my first Commodore, was our first Commodore. He was followed by Kermit Ayers, and then by Vern Lockhausen, whom I just talked about the TACAMO HERC transition, and again, my first NAV student. And I went to his change of command. He didn't know I was there, and he talked about a navigator instructor who many years ago had told him the importance of maintaining a good dead reckoning position, to know where you are and where you're going. And I was really touched that something I said was actually remembered. Next slide. So all of these things were highly unlikely, but they gave rise to the next event, which is the most unlikely event of all, which is the E-6A taking over the U.S. Air Force Looking Glass mission from the EC-135. I can't really go into a lot of details on this, but the big difference between the Looking Glass mission is that it is a decision-making platform, whereas TACAMO is a relay for decisions that have been made elsewhere. And that's about as much as you need to know. The Joint Staff directed the EC-135 was a pretty old platform going back to the early 60s. It could only transmit 20 kilowatts and could not orbit, so its connectivity to the submarines was poor. And in 92, the Joint Staff directed the E-6 to take on that mission in addition to its TACAMO mission. And so, again, involving Mickey DePasco and other people here at the Naval Air Development Center very extensively in the 1980s, the battle staff was added forward of Com Central, and in there was the airborne launch control that would allow them to launch Peacekeeper and Minuteman missiles from the aircraft, a voice conferencing system from the 135, and the UHF multiplex landline interface, and added a new Milstar extremely high frequency SATCOM system. They were to stand looking glass alerts at Offutt Air Force Base with the battle staff from the Strategic Command on board, while also providing TACAMO alerts at Pax River and Travis Air Force Base. And oh, by the way, at the same time, they were still doing 100% TACAMO in the Pacific and Atlantic. I can't give you a good count on the. Are you talking about the size of the battle staff versus the Navy crew? Yes. It's currently 9. Here. Well, they're not Air Force. It's a joint. The battle staff is joint. Okay. Yeah, and then the rest of it is basically about a 15-man crew, same as TACAMO. And I think it started out with about 6 and grew. And
it's probably a flag officer.
Yes.
The airframe modified to better execute the TACAMO?
The wing was primarily to get better low speed performance, essential to. The modified aircraft stood up to this mission in 1998 and was designated as the E-6B. Next slide. So now we're going back to the future. The E-6B has now been around for 30 years. And it's the last of the 707 line, the very last. There were no 707s made after the last E6. And there are parts that are seldom replaced that are out of stock. And if they break, they have to be re-engineered, remanufactured, and that takes a long time and costs big bucks. The C-130. And now we're going back to the EC-130J, which is a much higher performance perk with in-flight refueling and another set of capabilities. The E-6 is going to continue to fly the Airborne Command Post mission until the Air Force comes up with the replacement airframe or the E-6B falls out of the sky. I'm not very happy with the Air Force progress on that. 1954. Yeah, so it was a long run for the airplane. But the Herc came out in about the same year, and it's still in production and going strong. So anyway, we're going back to the EC-130. Back in the 1950s, when I was a kid, I went to the movies. If you came in late, you just stayed in your seat, and you sat there and watched the movie start until you got to the spot where you came in last. And that was about the time I decided it was time to retire. So anyway, and the important thing is just a dozen true believers made all this happen. It could not have happened with the one and done, the COs from other communities, and as a stash for passed over lieutenant commanders. It could not have continued. What would have happened had it not been for Bill Coyne, had it not been for his inspiration, had it not been for us 12 betting our careers we could make it happen? Don't know. Anyway, that's it. Back in the back there, we have books by myself, including this one, and books by my wife, and I hope you will take the time to go take a look at them and perhaps buy some. If you do, we'll sign them. And thank you for listening. Do you have any questions?
Okay, before we do questions, I'm gonna actually take the microphone so I can repeat the questions for the benefit of people online. And
Okay.
we'll just pass the mic back and forth.
Okay.
So if you can, yeah, just give me the mic now. All right. That's great. Okay, so again, for those who are online, for the benefit of those online, for any questions we have here locally, I'll repeat the question because we don't have the ability to pass the mic around here. And then we can open things up online for those that you have questions. Okay. All right. So we'll start here in Warminster. Yep. Go ahead. Okay. The question was, how long does an EMP blast last? Yeah. Lou, here's the mic.
Okay. Yes. The pulse itself lasts about 10 nanoseconds. Okay. And depending on what it does to equipment, as I said, it can damage, degrade, or upset the equipment. And upset was determined to be causing it to have to be reset, turned on and off, or damaged or degraded is self-explanatory. And so that answers your question.
Can a submarine talk directly to a satellite? And if so, why do you need a plane orbiting to
Okay. So the next question was, can a submarine actually communicate with a satellite, right? Can communicate directly with a satellite. So then what if you can do that directly with a satellite, what's the purpose of having these aircraft?
That's very easy. They can communicate with the satellite anytime they're on the surface or anytime they put their periscope up, which is something that missile boats never do, because then they become detectable. And in particular, if they were transmitting, that becomes a beacon pointing to the submarine. And my friend John over there knows all about killing submarines who give away their position. You need the relay.
Yes, you need the relay. And I think you also mentioned that one of the things that was being experimented with were blue-green lasers. So I think that was, correct me if I'm wrong, was that an attempt to be able to have satellite to submarines under the surface?
Yes, we were talking about blue-green lasers, and the idea was that blue-green lasers were believed they could penetrate the seawater. And there was two problems with blue-green lasers. And the first one is they didn't penetrate seawater just as well as they thought they might. And the second one is, where do you point it? When you don't know where the submarine is, where do you point the laser? And if you're just going to scan the whole ocean back and forth in the hopes you're going to pass over a submarine, there's a very high probability you won't. Next. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, so the question was for the EC-130J, will they be flying joint missions with the Air Force?
In answer to your question, no. The E-6B is going to continue that mission until the Air Force comes up with the replacement airframe. And because of the sensitivity, I don't want to go into a lot of detail on that. But the C-130J is going to be TACAMO only.
Second question, another base, Tinker Air Force Base, they commence their missions, they're on station time from Tinker, or do they go like Pax River and stand on alert, then tank fuel, and then do a mission over the water?
The latter is correct. The TACAMO alerts are stood at Pax River and Travis, and they are fully fueled and also air refuelable. So they're ready to go. And if you go down to Pax River, as you pass Taxiway Alpha, you will find them off to the right, the great white whales, usually two of them.
They were looking at land-based, very low frequency transmission from land-based ground units in the middle of the country, like West Virginia or something, to be able to communicate with the submarine that way as well. Is that not being used?
Yeah, so the question was about ELF, the very low frequency, the ground-based communication. And was that ever successful?
Yes. I was familiar with ELF in the 1980s. The problem is it's from 0.3 kilohertz to a fraction of that. So we're talking way sub-audio frequencies. And what happens to your data rate at way sub-audio frequencies? It gets very, very, very slow. And the only thing that I am aware it was ever used was to send trigraphs, which might translate, for instance, as come up to communications depth and copy the broadcast. But that's all they could get. 3 characters was the most that could send. Next. Yes.
So the question was, the Naval Air Development Center here in Warminster had a major role, had a major program with TACAMO. And can Lou briefly summarize what that was?
Yes, NADC had a major role. Going back to the beginning, they did a lot of studies on orbiting. There was a lot of issues in the early TACAMOs with something called yo-yo, which was causing the trailing wire antennas to break. They did research on that and helped solve that problem. And they specialized primarily in, I think, primarily in VLF. And in the 90s, they were a key role with Mickey DePasco, who some of you may know, in developing the Airborne Command Post suite. What they're doing these days, I'm not privy right now. Yes.
In the very beginning, you only had 2 C-130s. At some point, they had to come down for maintenance. I'm wondering, how did you get away with just using 2 birds for so long?
Question was, how many C-130s were originally deployed, and how did they coordinate any maintenance issues with that?
Actually, the 2 squadrons had 4, and the VQ3 had 4, and VQ4 had 8. Now, in the TACAMO 2, they each had 2 roll-on, roll-off vans and 2 aircraft each squadron. But they were not flying 100%. At that time, it was an interim capability. You couldn't do it with just 2 aircraft.
They had the antennas installed, or did you have to move the antenna?
No, with the with the roll-on, roll-off fans, I'm not exactly sure how how that worked, but the antenna and the feed-through tube was installed. And although I think they could go to another C-130, I don't think they ever did. Next.
I'm going to go ahead and open things up to the folks online because I know you've been very patient. I know there is one question in chat. Were the orbits always performed in one direction, or did they alternate direction in order to keep wing loading balanced?
As I recall, and I'm not a pilot, so I don't know this for sure, I think they generally did counterclockwise orbits due to the torque off of the engines, but I may be wrong. I think they could probably do them both directions. I think most preferred to orbit counterclockwise.
I actually have a partial answer to that because I've actually asked the question to an engineer who actually worked here at NEDC who developed the trailing wires. And what I recall from that discussion was that the trailing wire actually had aerodynamic characteristics of its own. And I think part of the direction was also predicated by I think the twist on the wire. Yeah, so I think that was also a factor. So I think it was basically always in one direction.
Yeah, that's what I remember being up on the flight deck, and of course back aft. As comm officer or mission commander, I had no idea which way they were turning. Just that it took a lot more effort to walk because we were pulling about a G and a half to 2 Gs, I think.
Okay. All right. Anyone else online? If there are any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Come on, Dan. I know
Hi, Eleanor. Can you hear me? This is
Yes,
Scott.
Scott. Yes, Scott, you were on that call with
Yeah.
Marshalinsky. So yeah, I
Yeah.
don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Well, as far as orbiting any mission I was on, and I only had 1,500 hours as crew, it was always to the left, always to the left, as far as the orbit went. But it kind of on a personal note, when were you ever at TACAMO in Barbers Point?
I was not. I had a tour in VQ3 and a tour in tour in VQ4 and then a tour in VQ3 in the late 80s. And I made a decision in 82. Phil Baca and Bob Downey were both competing to get me into the squadron as a department head, and I decided because both those guys and Ed Hampshire had screened by having a carrier tour that I figured that was the secret sauce. So I took a carrier tour instead of a major department head tour, and when I came up for command in 85, everybody had 3 squadron tours except me. And so I didn't screen for command. I did make commander. And so I finished out my career in the National Emergency Airborne Command Post and Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff.
Oh, dude, that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is a spectacular career. My pop was a Mustanger in the 50s, and he finished as a major in the Air Force. So I understand some of the pecking order for officers and what went on there. I was a young enlisted tech, and a little bit different kind of career. But I was at TACAMO at VQ3 right as we were getting ready to take on the E6, and had some parts in that. And I thank you for your service and this great book, and you coming on here and helping me fill in a bunch of gaps because I'm very interested in the subject. And I actually have worked with Vern and when I was active. So it's a real privilege. Thank you, sir. And I'll yield the mic.
All right. Right. And yes, Scott, thank you for putting me in touch with Vern Lockhausen, who, spoke here for us last year. Any other questions? Oh, we had some other questions here locally, so I'm going to go ahead and we're going to head and field those. Oh, the question was, what caused the so-called yo-yo problem with the trailing wire?
It was kind of complicated. The new wire with the TACAMO 4 system was lighter. It was stronger, but it was lighter. And you have to go through a process called stalling the drogue, because as someone pointed out, the drogue and the wire have aerodynamic capabilities. And the pilots go through a particular maneuver to stall the drogue so that it hangs vertically down below the aircraft. And if you don't do that right, that combination of lift on the drogue will cause it to go up and down like a yo-yo, and that will eventually break the wire. You change the procedures that the pilots used, and there are certain things they could see up there. They could see, for instance, the tension on the wire was one of their readouts, and the figure 6,000 pounds strikes my memory. It may not be right, but they have to get it in that range and keep it in that range. And when they do that, the drogue is stalled and will not yo-yo. Ed Hampshire, who was my aircraft commander in VQ4, my companion at Monterey, my ASPO at NavAir when I was doing the ECX planning and the EMP op eval, and later on when I am a civilian at NavAir, he's my program manager, so he and I go back, and he's also my first instructor pilot because I actually started out as a pilot, so he was my instrument instructor. But he was the one who developed most of the details on avoiding the orbit. And one of the things he brought into the program in 92, thereabouts, was the orbit improvement system, which coupled to the autopilot and taught the autopilot how to fly that perfect orbit that Ed Hampshire knew how to fly. That answer your question?
And what I just put on screen is actually a rough rendering by a gentleman who actually, if you've ever seen our P3 documentary that this gentleman produced, then we helped to contribute to, he actually produced this rendering for something that Vern Lockhausen had requested. This is one of the original C-130s and just the beginning of that long trailing wire deployment from the rear of the C-130. So I just wanted to, in case you were trying to visualize what this looked like, I thought this might be helpful.
Goes out, part of the drogue doesn't stay here. This is where it nests when it's fully retracted. But that is the long trailing wire antenna going out. Short trailing wire, which came in a later version of this aircraft, came out of the tail. Some possibility of tank.
So I imagine that the trailing wire, I always think of it almost like a retractable like cord on, on your hair dryer. Yes.
On there, the old reel looked like a giant fishing reel, including having the little finger that went along to keep the wire wrapping in the right place, like not like a circular reel, but like the old-fashioned kind. And there is, and I know I was on a communications exercise off Hawaii, and we had a misspool on the reel. And that means that one of the wires gets wrapped over the other instead of next to it. And we had to unwrap that reel, and the misspool was on the very last wrap. And my reel operator was standing on the reel, carefully pushing it out with his feet while the other guy stayed on the brake so it didn't get away from him and suck this guy flip through the reel. And I'm sitting there as a lieutenant commander saying, oh my God, is this going to work out right? Should I be doing? And so anyway, we got down and there was the misspool about 10 lines in from the end. And he got it out. And then we brought it back in, cleared the misspool. And I asked him, what holds that wire on? Because I didn't know. And he said, nothing, sir. You know, so we were, we could have lost the whole time. So, but had we lost the whole thing, we probably would have lost that reel operator too. So anyway, next question. I did. I bought him.
So we have another question in chat, and then I think we're going to go ahead and wrap after this question. But it was another question about ELF, and the question was ELF the system that had a 60-mile buried cables in Wisconsin?
That's the one.
Of course, when I think of ELF, I think of a great X-Files episode about ELF, but that's a separate story. All right. Well, this has been fantastic. A wealth of information about TACAMO. Very grateful for your time to come up from lovely La Plata, Maryland, for this lecture. And again, for those of you here local in Warminster, there are Lou and his wife's books in the back. Please, feel free to make a purchase. If for any of you left online, if you did want to get a signed copy of one of Lou's books, or if, I believe it, reach out to me and we can coordinate. Or okay.
Lewis, Lewis -McIntyre.
Okay. All right. I'll put that in the chat so you can. Okay. Okay, I'll just repeat that in case you weren't able to hear. I will put in chat Lou's his website address, and you can order signed copies of either his books or his wife Karen's books through that website. So if you want to hang on, I will go ahead and do that as well. But I think other than that, we're going to go ahead and conclude this evening. I want to thank you again. Thank you everybody coming here and bearing with us with our attempt to live stream this evening. And for those online, appreciate your participation as well. And join us next month. We're going to have another live stream event here for our May event with Jim Sobek, who joined us actually remotely, but he will be here in Warminster next month. So looking forward to that as well. So thanks everybody. Thank you very much. And I'm going to consider it a good evening, but hang online, anyone, if you want that address for any signed books. All right. And I think I will do that too. All right. Well, thank you.